Thank you, Gil. That's an incredible panel. It's great to moderate another panel after yours. So welcome, everyone. I'm Qinglong Dai, a professor at the Johns Hopkins University, Carey Business School, and also at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. As part of the workshop's planning committee, I'm honored to be moderating this session. In the next hour, we will discuss a topic that is near and dear to my heart as a supply chain professor, which is about PPE standards around marketing, stockpiling, and distribution of products, and what can be done to streamline for this process for more resilient supply chain. Now, imagine we are all on sailing ship, navigating the unpredictable waters of stormy ocean. So our frontline workers are the sailors. So they are bravely navigating the choppy waters of the pandemic. And like any sailor, they need the right equipment to weather the storm, which is where the PPE comes in. Now, what happens if the ship is damaged and there are leaks in the hull? The strategic national stockpile is like emergency supplies on the ship, and need standards to ensure their effectiveness. So like sailors inspecting and maintaining the equipment, we must keep PPE supplies seaworthy, so as to speak, to keep frontline workers safe. Our frontline workers are counting on us to keep them safe as they navigate the stormy seas of the pandemic. Now, industry best practices standards for storage and stockpiling of PPE needed in a public health emergency, not just pandemic, are critical and help support a functioning supply chain. So it's like building a fortified wall to protect us from an approaching enemy. So the stronger the wall, the stronger our defenses. We need to make sure the wall we build is strong enough to protect us. Now, the marketing, stockpiling, and distribution of products are among many links of the PPE supply chain we are talking about so far. So if one link weakens or breaks, the entire chain is at risk of falling apart, and we cannot deliver the products to the hands of users. It could be healthcare workers, it could also be the general public. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, demand for PPE skyrocketed, and supply chains struggled to keep up, exposing the fragility of the entire system. So that's a period of time during which I learned this proverb from Professor Chris Tang, who will be speaking shortly. So distant water will not quench a fire nearby. So we need to make sure the water is nearby when we have a fire. So the fire can be a pandemic, can be a war, can be emergency, can be either something as in a lot of situations well beyond a pandemic. Now, to ensure frontline workers and the public have the PPE they need, we must strengthen every link in the chain through implementing standards for marketing, labeling, and stockpiling, as well as developing data infrastructure and feedback loops for equitable distribution. So only then can we create a strong and reliable defense against future health emergencies. Today, we have an exciting panel of experts who will share their insights and experiences. They will draw upon their experience in public health, supply chain management, and emergency management. They will help us identify solutions that will make the PPE supply chain more resilient and also more effective. First, we will have Professor Chris Tang from UCLA. So the Professor Tang is followed by Barbara DeBon from Cynosure Health, and Skip Skivington from Kaiser Permanente, Colin Miller for the National Personal Protective Technology Laboratory, which is part of NIOSH, and Sean Kais from Tennessee Department of Health, and Ann Miller from Project A95. So if you'd like more information about the panelists, a link to their bios has been posted on the event webpage. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to speak, and then we will have a question and answer period where you can ask them questions. I encourage you to open your hearts and minds and join this important discussion. So let's work together to ensure that our frontline workers and our general public have the protection they need and deserve. And thank you for your attention. I look forward to a productive session. Now, without further ado, let's move on to our speaker presentations. Our first speaker is Professor Chris Tang, distinguished professor at UCLA.
Ping Long, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Well, I love your metaphor. Yes, we're all in the same boat, and we have to weather the uncertain storm. Then the question is how can we build a robust supply chain that will protect us, and also that is agile and flexible and sustainable. Now, for the yesterday and this morning sessions, there are a lot of discussions about standards of the PPE. Definitely, we need to consider that proactively. At the same time, also some discussion about supply chain. But I think that I'd like to highlight that maybe there's a missing link. We cannot really discuss these two topics in isolation. The reason is what type of standard you established will affect the type of supply chain you will have. So therefore, we need to be very careful about how to specify a standard, which is product specification, and also understand how it affects the supply chain design, because that will affect our resiliency. So in that case, we really need to establish the understanding about the linkage between these two issues, how the standards or the standardizations will affect the supply chain design. So to delve into these issues, let me paint two scenarios that we can relate to. I have studied mask, well, for obvious reasons, during the COVID, the surgical mask and N95 and face mask. So let's think about the first scenario. NIOSH did not really have the standards for the N95 mask because it was really for industrial use. But then during the emergency, we tried to adopt the ASTM, the F2100 series, the standards. That standards focus on filtration, how well you block the virus, the micron particles, the breathability, how the differential pressure from the airflow, blood penetration in terms of the water repellency, and the last one, the capability to of the antimicrobial. So in that case, protect us. Now, these standards really have well established, but they are really focused on single use, low cost, single use, surgical masks, or even N95 masks. Now, for this type of mask, there are companies in the US that is trying to establish, but they're not cost competitive. When the demand surge, they flourish. When open up to import the masks from China, most of them are bankrupt. So in 2021, the American Mask Manufacturing Association were concerned about the viability of this kind of domestic resilient supply chain. So therefore, unless for this kind of standards, it's more practical to have a maybe near shore from Mexico, or a small subset, a small group of domestic manufacturers to produce this kind of standard mask. But even for the US based, unless the hospitals or the governments willing to provide the subsidies, these companies cannot compete, all right, because it's highly automated. So therefore, we need to rethink about maybe this is a moment in time to rethink maybe the new standards more proactively. So this workshop is really, really timely and important, not just in terms of the protection, even in terms of the viability of a domestic regional supply chain. All right, so let me paint the second scenario. The second scenario is to up the ante, to change maybe a more comprehensive standards such that it's more inclusive. So in addition to the standard we mentioned before, filtration, breathability, repellency, and antimicrobial pulpit, we also add other dimensions that will give actually United States a possibility to really develop new type of mask. This is reusability. Instead of single use, can we develop masks that is actually can be used multiple times? All right. So that is especially for the community mask. Second, in terms of washable, we have to figure out how to wash it, so to clean it, so that we can reusable. Third one is actually how to dispose at the end of life. Because right now, a lot of surgical masks are supposed to be burned to do it, because these are synthetic materials, is not easily degradable. Now that leads to the next one, materials. Instead of using the melt-blown material, can we use different new materials, such as using copper particle? There are new materials that we can bombard the copper particle into the cotton filament, so that you can weave into fabrics that the copper is embedded into the fiber. Then we use electrical charges that will actually to block, to trap, to immobilize the viruses and the bacteria. That technology is being developed. So, and also the last one, size. Right now, we don't have one size fits all, but I think that we need to be more inclusive to think about how to do that. As a result, I think that we need to consider different types of supply chains to support this type of mask, so that we can build a more resilient supply chain that domestically or regionally. So I think that in real time, I just want to sum up that I think that we need to take this moment in time, that there's not one type mask, we can have a different type mask, such that we can really develop a resilient public health supply chain that would also to establish a new standard, that's such that United States can continue to be more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tang. And I really like your linkage between the standards of PPE and also the design of supply chain, and also emphasis on domestic and also regionalized supply chain for future pandemics. So now move on to our next speaker, Barbara Debon, who is from Cynosure Health.
Hi, everybody. I'm just marveling at how great it is that I'm tucked in between UCLA and Kaiser Permanente, because the invitation that I received to join this panel was primarily because much of my work in the last 3 years has been in rural settings, specifically in critical access hospitals, which are, as you know, 25-bed hospitals with very limited resources, with very little experience with even using N95s. Most of them don't even have negative pressure rooms, so they weren't accustomed to even using these materials. And then to kind of layer on that, the fact that so many of these hospitals that typically would have an average daily census of 2 or maybe 3 patients, suddenly were at capacity because they weren't able to transfer their patients to the referring facilities because they were full. And so it was just kind of this whole big Bermuda Triangle dissection, or intersection, I should say. And I like to use the term that, yeah, in the last 3 years, we've been in the same storm, but definitely not in the same boat. And I wanted to just bring the whole perspective of the impact and how incredibly challenging this has been for our partners, our facilities that work in rural settings that don't have, they're not big purchasers of equipment. So they don't have the relationships with the manufacturers or the vendors. And so some of them struggled because they weren't able to purchase 1,000 of something because they didn't have a history of purchasing. So my perspective is, even though I'm a city kid, I live in San Francisco, and I did a lot of work in the early days in some large academic medical centers that were struggling, but in perspective, they had it pretty good when we compared the experience of some of our rural settings. Now, I don't mean to imply that every state had this issue. I'll use Montana as an example. They had a great program, great access to stockpiles. They broke down their silos, they worked together, they partnered, they got together not just the large hospitals, but the critical access hospitals, the long-term care facilities, the nursing homes. They all they figured out a way to get together, play in the same sandbox. And I'd like to see more of that. That's what I'd like to see, is more collaboration, less competition, and just figure this out collectively. And I really do believe that it's possible because I've seen it happen. So those are my remarks. I hope we can have more discussion about this topic and the disparities and how really super challenging it is for these smaller hospitals who are really out. I hear people say, where's a critical access hospital? And people say, well, find the middle of nowhere and it's 100 miles from there. And so, for those of us that live in cities and have access to so many resources, it's just a different world. So didn't want to lose that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I think what you have talked about, even large health systems struggled with getting PPE, but even smaller ones probably having even worse struggles. We have to be aware of the differences between different providers. Now, move on to the next speaker, Steve Skivington from Kaiser Permanente.
Yes, hi everybody. Thanks for having me. And Barbara, trust me, even large organizations, we were competing with the dental office down the block to get to the same supply chain. So, size matters in most days, but in this case, size did not matter at all. Trust me, it helped, but didn't solve the problem. And I'm Skip Skivington with Kaiser Permanente. I'm a vice president for healthcare continuity. Been with the organization over 30 years. So, and I've had many roles in the emergency management function. So I've seen a lot. And the pandemic shouldn't have been an eye-opening experience, but I know it was for a lot of people because we've been there, done that. When you look at every public health emergency since the advent of particularly N95 respirators, because that was the holy grail that we were trying to get all day, every day. We've seen the same issue occur. So either we solve this as a nation, because it is a national security issue in my view. We can go through all the reasons for that, but it's quite obvious. So either solve it, or at least let's set up a support group for some of us that keep going through this, because we keep having the same discussion after every event. And I'm going to go off script a bit, because when we talked about stockpiling isn't the issue either. I don't think there's a single issue. It has to be an all of government, all of industry approach. Because if you remember, one of the last crises we had was H1N1. The state of California had the foresight to buy millions of N95 respirators for the event that might come along. And it was before H1N1. And we had to use the stockpile, and our facility was one of them, even though we had quite a bit of a product internally. But what we've learned was when we had the fit test our people, 7 out of 10 of our nurses couldn't get a fit. And then the state was saying, and the manufacturer, it's no secret, 3M was saying, well, it's got to be your faulty test processes. And we've been doing this for 20 years. It wasn't our test process. So we finally got them to come down and look at it, and they go, oh, the reason for the fail rate is because these are more industrial related N95s and not the medically specific N95s. Who knew that there was 2 different products and standards? And so until we can sort out those kinds of things, and God knows how many other nuances occur in this, in just that one item, that could make the difference in a future pandemic. Because if things continue to go the way they are, we'll clear this, and then our memories fade, and then we'll go off to other things. But if we get another surge, we're going to have the same issue. We've got more supply, yes, but the same constraints are there. The same complexity in government is there. The same issues regarding standards are going to be there. We need to find a way to streamline that, to make it easier for those that need them the most. Because when the pandemic was gearing up, we had a meeting with my chief medical officer and myself, in Secretary Azar's office, with other health systems and industry leaders, and we were told, you as an industry may need to lead us through this crisis, because government can't respond in enough time to get what you need. So all of those standards got relaxed. We appreciate that. We were able to do some pivoting to make sure we got what we needed. But it was a struggle. And so one of my famous anecdotes was, it felt more like buying street drugs, because we had all these non-traditional, unqualified vendors that were reaching out from everywhere across the globe. And so we had to go through due diligence, because one, they wanted the money up front, and we refused to pay anybody up front. We wanted to see proof of product. We wanted to see their certifications. And some of them were not honest with that, as you can imagine. So we had it felt like dealing with a kidnapper that had a ransom for the victim to be returned. We wanted to see a newspaper with today's date next to their certification documentation, so that we could validate at least that was current as of that day. One of the deals famously moved along, and they said, "Hey, we got product in. It's cleared customs. It's in the port of LA. Come on down." So we went with a truck. We went with money to inspect the product and then deliver it. And they kept getting stalled. And then finally, someone came out and said, "Oh, U.S. Customs came in and swooped in and took the product and deviated it to the government." And we kept hearing those stories similarly from other organizations. And but when I fact checked that with the feds, they debunked that, because again, it was just another someone trying to make a quick buck. And that was the environment. We hope that we can do better than that next time. And I'll stop and look forward to any further discussions.
Thank you, Skip. And so far we have heard from Chris from a supply chain perspective, a supply chain design perspective. We have heard from Barbara and Skip about providers' perspective. Now move on. We're going to hear from a regulator or from quality control perspective from Colin Miller from National Personal Protective Technology Laboratory.
Good morning, or almost afternoon. I am one of the leaders of the NIOSH respirator approval program, and there's so much I could talk about, but I'm going to start with my planned remarks and then try to touch on a little bit about what's already been brought up. So specific to marketing and labeling, or perhaps branding, I want to talk about private label versions of NIOSH approved respirators, and begin by reminding that a private label version of a NIOSH approved respirator is made by the approval holder and is the same product that they make and label as their own. The difference being that the approval label or labels and the user instruction will identify another entity, the private label assignee. So CVS, Home Depot are really good examples, right? The NIOSH approval holder makes the same respirator and puts their customer's name on it. We hear that a lot from them. Our customers want this, our customers want that. They then package and release the product for sale and use. The user is informed that this is a NIOSH approved respirator, that it was made by the approval holder for the private label assignee. So when you think about it, there's really no increase in capacity to make more approved respirators, right? The approval holder can make what they can make. Perhaps there's even a reduction in their capacity, as the approval holder must make changes to their labeling or their packaging or some part of their process. There are multiple approval holders that use a private label model for their business. I think it's fair to say this is a more common practice for non-domestic filter and face piece respirator manufacturers. They achieve an approval and then they offer private label versions to many others. NIOSH and users are trusting that the private label company does not take steps to alter the respirator, the labeling, or the user instruction, or make a claim, that we didn't see as part of that approval package. From the NIOSH approval program's perspective, private labeling can be burdensome, but the process we follow is necessary. The approval holder must apply to NIOSH for an extension of approval. We don't need to test the respirator, we've already done that, but we do review the drawing, the labeling, and the user instructions. Our database captures the model or part number associated with the private label version, so we have records. But despite all this, the business relationships between the approval holder and the private label assignee may be long or short. The customer asks the approval holder to make a number of respirators. Let's say they want to order 500,000 filtering face piece respirators. They're made, they're distributed or sold to users, and they have a lifetime that's not really easily tracked. Typically, approval holders do not come back to NIOSH and say, hey, that private label version isn't active and should no longer be used. Like, because they're on to their next sale, their next customer. It's challenging to provide up-to-date information to users on our NIOSH certified equipment list about what private label exists on any given point in time. Because private label versions do not increase capacity, but require a NIOSH approval program resources, since February of last year, private label applications are our lowest priority as we are assigning approval applications for review. As the emergency declaration comes to an end and we transition back to more conventional operations, we're working on steps to improve the process about how we complete our private label applications. One step will be reaching out to the private label assignee to remind them they cannot change the approval. Now that we have registered several certification marks, including N95, with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, we are actively conducting brand protection investigations and marketplace weekly report reviews, and are often authenticating whether or not that private label information is accurate. So, since all this is required, we realize private labels offer an advantage to some approval holders to extend their line of what they can sell. We realize that for some people, it's very much about brand loyalty. You know, we buy your welding equipment and your PPE from the vendor. We think that in terms of stockpiling, private labeling should not be considered. We should be looking to making sure that the approval holders, models, and brands are offered in the stockpile simply because they are more controlled. And I have plenty of other topics to talk about, but I was warned that my 5 minutes are up.
Thank you very much, Colleen. That's very eye-opening. I think it's also one of those topics I imagine will trigger a lot of discussion, a lot of questions. So move on to Sean Kais from Tennessee Department of Health.
Oh, one of the first topics I want to bring up is something I mentioned yesterday on here. Many of the pieces of PPE that we have to respond to are put in there by standards. One of the things that we have to do is for OSHA, on the OSHA Ebola PPE matrix, I don't know if many of you have seen that, but it's quite a beast of a response matrix to tell you what you have to have. You know, ranging from hood covers to booties to aprons and even the fabric that I brought up yesterday. So that's the ASTM 1671 or the ISO 16604 or even the AAMI level 4 gown. What this does allow us is it gives us a variety of things that we can use to respond to this and still be under the good graces of OSHA on this. So we can move from coveralls to a gown, which many healthcare organizations are much more comfortable wearing depending upon their own personal preferences. So that does open up the supply chain for us very often. Many times on the side that we look at things on the side of chemical response is something that healthcare organizations may not necessarily be used to. And they have to look forward to something like the OSHA level A through D, or a private company making a standard, the NFPA class 1 through 4, or oftentimes they are used to military standard, the mission-oriented protective posture MOC gear, being a 4 through 0. So 3 different sets of standards that they may be used to dealing with or have to introduce themselves to. And they end up having to follow OSHA first receiver, best practices for hospital-based first receiver victims from mass casualty incidents involving the released hazardous substance 2005. This assumes that you're not doing direct entry on this, but if you look at table 3 on page 23 of this, it gives you the minimum standard of just a chemical resistant suit. It does in fact talk about standards that it can, companies that produce They're acceptable, but lots of those from 2005 have different names by now. And so you end up looking at the major manufacturers of what you should be wearing. So if you look at something like DuPont, they have 9 different flavors of Tychem suits and 7 different kinds of Tyvek. And if you look at something like Kepler, they also have something of 12 different kinds of fabric. Not all companies have multiples like this. Something like Lakeland only has 3 to move for. And a lot of times we end up allowing the manufacturer of these materials to dictate what it is we're going to use based upon if they say healthcare in one of them, that's probably the one the health industry is going to pick out of it. So there is a variety of things that can meet the minimum requirement. And because we only have to meet the minimum, it is okay if we end up using something like Tychem 10,000, even though that is far and beyond what we need since we are not doing direct entry. But it does allow us to operate at a standard that we can move to. One of the parts of PPT that we have that I've had to deal with going from the 2016 Gatlinburg wildfires, or from using tuberculosis examinations of patients, or even COVID for anterooms, are air cleaning circulators. A lot of times people bypass some of these as a way to cleanse the air before you breathe it. And a lot of times they do not have medical specific parts of this. And so when we are going and looking for air circulating devices on this, a lot of times we've had pushback because there's not a medical specific. But if you look at the MMWR from June 6, 2003, the CDC in fact does specify that it is very acceptable and encouraged to use industrial equipment on this. So you can buy industrial air cleaning circulators. Very well, but the problem with this is the media that you use to filter. Everyone is used to the N95 standard. That would not be possible without the University of Tennessee and Dr. Peter Tsai. Pat Tennessee on the back for that. But a lot of what we have are different standards that go with filtering material. So we have HEPA filters, which is a designation by the Department of Energy. We have MERV, the minimum efficiency reporting value, which is designated by the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, Air Conditioning Engineers. We have MPR, which is designated by 3M. And we have FPR, the filter performance rating, that is made by Home Depot. All of these are very wildly varying about the numbers that they use to designate what meets their standards. HEPA has one standard, it is the HEPA standard. MERV, when you have MERV 13 is what we're looking for virus cleansing, and 3M designates that same amount at 1500 to 1900, whereas Home Depot just has a 10. These are important because a lot of times for industrial air cleaning devices, we designate a size that fits it, and then we need to go and find the filtering material that is appropriate for our use. But sometimes Home Depot may be the only thing around, and we cannot get a HEPA filter if there's an emergency. And so we have to know that we need to look for an FPR of 10 in order to meet our needs. Sometimes this can be a hindrance due to the multitude of standards, but it does open up what we can use across the board in an emergency. We just have to be very conscious and know about these standards ahead of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. Wow, that was really mind-boggling, complicated set of standards. I'm so grateful. I don't have to deal with those standards. Thank you for that sharing. And last but certainly not least, from Ann Miller, Executive Director at Project A95.
Thank you, Dr. Dye. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to all of you here today. The other panelists have provided a perspective from larger organizations like states and big buyers. I'm really here to speak from the perspective of small physician practices and from clinics and the consumer primarily. I know we're here because we share an interest in learning from the pandemic and making better plans. And yesterday in the British Medical Journal, Abrar Karan had a quote that was, he's an infectious disease doc at Stanford. He said, if we're to be ready for the next pandemic, we can't fall back into the same cycle of panic neglect. And that's really the place that I'm coming from in my remarks today. Nonprofit Project N95 was born in the early days of the pandemic to get PPE to docs and nurses and small clinics. They were completely shut out, as you've heard, from the small hospital experience and we were unable to buy at all, respirators, isolation gowns, gloves. There's a lot of counterfeit product where they face impossibly large minimum order quantities. But we moved from that model once we understood that everybody needed protection. And now we are here working to protect all people. I just want to comment on equitable access. I mean, we know that certain populations have been disproportionately impacted by COVID, by policies that were put in place over many decades, right, that have limited their access to healthcare. We know that Black, Latinx, and tribal populations have been disproportionately impacted by COVID, and we should be able to do something about that as a society. And that's part of what Project N95 is working on. So I think that there are opportunities to put together standards, as we've heard today, right? And like I sometimes think like another standard, right? But we know that standards, product and marketing standards, and supply chain improvements can help. NIOSH standards have been fabulous during the pandemic, right? People know that that product will perform to the standard. And the other thing is that that standard specifies marketing claims, and so you can verify the packaging against that standard. And the third thing is it's not just the standard, but you know that there's ongoing monitoring of production so that you know that batch after batch is going to perform to that standard. That is for industrial, for occupational uses only, however, and there's no agency that's actually looking out for consumers. So we need an enforced, and somebody, I think it was Jill Morgan in the last session, was talking about like self-attestation or self-certified. We need an enforced consumer standard so that consumers know that they're getting the level of protection that they think they are, and that they're not getting fake or substandard masks. Now, it sounds complicated to get a consumer standard, but we know other countries have this, right? So it's not like we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can make it our own, but the consumer standard needs to address the population from age 2 to 102. And those face forms are really different. They're not the same face form as it is for the N95. We know that consumers overwhelmingly prefer ear loop masks, despite the fact that they don't fit well. And we need to have free and accessible fit testing, or we need to innovate against the standard to produce a mask that doesn't require fit testing. And there are some today that are like that. So this consumer marketing standard, as Colleen was talking about, we need to have marketing claims established in that standard. There's been rampant misrepresentation of product performance, people saying that FDA registration was some sort of endorsement of the product, right? That they were claiming to prevent COVID, or they're misrepresenting their filtration rate, or saying that they're made in the US when they aren't. Throughout the pandemic, consumers have been forced to buy inferior products at inflated prices online. And it's really, for me, it's like I can see people like out in the wild wearing a KN95, and I can tell just by looking at it that it doesn't meet the standard. And it's really heartbreaking, like to know that somebody spent their hard-earned money, they've basically gotten ripped off, and they have a false sense of confidence. We need an agency that is actually looking to protect consumers and with an enforced standard. So the thing that for me, like I think about trust. Consumers have lost trust in public health, unfortunately, at this point, and they have lost trust in respiratory protection. A standard helps address both of those things, right? A consumer standard enables manufacturers to innovate against that standard, produce new products that meet it. As Dr. Dai was saying and Dr. Tang, right? We can make them reusable, washable, recyclable. And this standard also it creates confidence for consumers. The last thing I'll say is I know I'll be running out of time, but we need to get a domestic manufacturing, or as we said, regional manufacturing. I know this isn't news to everybody, but we know that a number of US entrepreneurs have expended capital, and mostly, patriotic intent, right? But they also, they had commercial interests, but most of these guys are either out of business or headed that way. I personally know 5 that are out of business. And so I know my time is coming to an end, but I would like to say that I think that our lack of preparedness today for the pandemic, for the next pandemic, this is an emergency today. Our lack of preparedness. We have to do something different than we've done before. It's infuriating. I'm going to join Skip's support group after this session. So we need fit testing in every firehouse. We need consumer mask standards, including a mask marketing standard. We need to contract with domestic manufacturing, because we know that those products can't be counterfeit. We need stockpiles for consumer masks. Consumers need to trust their mask, and we need the support of the community, policymakers, government to make this happen, right? We need to have contracts, required government contracts. I just want to say our air is shared, right? We're all breathing the same air. Everybody needs protection, and we need to put in the new standards that will give it to us. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. And so thank you for the really passionate and also insightful sharing. You spoke on my mind. I cannot recall how many times I almost cried when I spoke to media during the pandemic, because people don't realize there's an emergency. I think realizing we have an emergency, even in 2023, is really a starting point. Now we are turning to Q&A and in the next 25 minutes or so. But first of all, I want to ask this question for everyone, because I understand that Chris has to rush to the port of LA in about 3 minutes to prepare for the next supply chain crisis. So I want to ask each of our panelists, after you have heard from the rest of the panel, do you feel like more optimistic or pessimistic? Maybe let's start with Chris.
Well, thank you for having me. Well, I think that I really enjoy all the discussions and also all the ideas. So I think I'm more optimistic. I'm an optimist. But I think that now we are at least we expose the issues. But how do we take the next step? I think that is a big problem. We had the physical supply chain, we also the digital supply chain, but then we also need to have also the commonly understanding with the standards. So I think public awareness, public trust, as Anne pointed out, I think is needed. So I think that there are a lot of work to be done, but I think that everyone needs to really work together to cooperate and collaborate, as Barbara pointed out earlier. So I think I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Feel free to leave and another minutes. So next, when we follow the sequence of speaking sequence, then move on to Barbara. Do you feel more hope or less?
I am kind of a half full kind of girl. So right now I'm feeling quite hopeful. Just having this discussion, and Anne, I mean, your comment about lack of trust of the consumers. For me, one of the most heartbreaking things in the last 3 years is seeing our healthcare providers wearing equipment that they believed was protecting them, and we knew it wasn't. And that to me is, we all know COVID didn't cause the problem, it just exposed it. And we had, I think it was Skip that mentioned, we have these memories that just kind of fade. So I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful that we're recognizing opportunities and looking at ways for us to collaborate and make this term standard actually mean something. Because learning from you, Sean, how many different standards there are from different companies, it's like, what does it even mean? So yeah, I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Skip, I think toward the end of your sharing, you seems to be alluding to the fact that the fundamental supply chain infrastructure hasn't changed much. If there's another pandemic, which is almost certain, right? It's not about if, but when, we may not be ready. So do you feel like your view has been updated a little bit after hearing from the rest of the panel?
Well, let me first preface it by saying, as a person, I am very optimistic. I'm with Barbara on the glass is always half full, and I can even squeeze that even higher in my mind. As a proof point is, I was reared in the Washington, D.C. area, and I continue to root for the Washington Commanders, even though it's like they're a dreadful football team. So that gives you an idea how optimistic I am as a person. But I'm going to be brutally honest. Am I optimistic about our performance in the next pandemic? Oh, hell no. And don't misunderstand my comments. I'm a die-in-the-wool capitalist. I believe in the free market. I believe in government. Government has a role in all of this. But we're so complex, and that complexity serves us well in peacetime. It really does. But I look at it as an analogy. We're at war with the pandemic, And those trying to do the same thing that we do, the way we do things in peacetime, just doesn't work on a war-footing environment, which we find ourselves, and we're just coming out of that. And there's too much complexity, too much fiefdom. Again, our system of government serves us well day in, day out. But we can't have national organizations saying, well, this is the standard, and then the state says, oh no, this isn't working for us. And then you overlay that with a county that says, oh no, I'm the king of this area. You got to do it this way. And that just defies logic. It just drives us crazy. We have to do that and perform in those environments, and we do. But there's a lot easier way to go about it, and we've got to learn from this and fix this. And quite frankly, I don't know what the answer is. It's so complicated. But I know if we can solve other gnarly problems in this country, we can solve this one too. And I just wish there was, I applaud Marianne and Tenor and Linda for taking a run at this, but I don't think they're going to solve it, and I love them to death.
Thank you, Skip. We have already got quite a few questions from audience, but I do not miss the opportunity to hear from Colleen, Sean, and Anne about your overall perspective after you have heard from the rest of the panel.
Thank you. So I think that the last 3 years have been a roller coaster. And I would say that at the beginning, I was so hopeful that the world would come to understand that NIOSH approved respirators aren't approved just for specific industries, that there was plenty of a product that could be used by healthcare workers, and that people would gain an understanding of the differences between a mask and a respirator. There were times throughout the response where that hope was set aside because healthcare workers demanded surgical N95s, right? Even though we've done the work to show that those additional requirements don't add to the respiratory protection. In fact, they're carried over from a drape catching fire, for example. And then I think now that we're able to look back and have these opportunities, I am hopeful again that we will be able to talk about, what is needed and what is not, and remove some of those redundancies. I, for example, am very hopeful that after all of this, we will be able to add a fit requirement to our regulation. We had so many people new to this area come to us, NIOSH, I want to get approved. And I would say, okay, do you understand your respirator has to fit? And they were like, they didn't even understand what that meant, and that, it was a requirement for it to fit to protect someone. So adding the respirator fit capability to our regulation would be just a simple step to say, like, it already says it needs to fit. Here's how we want you to show us that it will fit someone. It's not going to fit everyone, but it's going to fit someone. That would be a really big step. And then, as Marianne mentioned, we are, offering some innovative challenges, right, to try to address what we did learn. And I think that's very hopeful, right? We have a mobile facial scanning app that we're working on developing. We have a respirator fit challenge. How can we have just-in-time fit testing? And, we're working on training the trainers with fire departments and health departments, hoping to update our toolkit. So yeah, I think I am hopeful. I will say this, I always say to the new approval holders, welcome to our nerdy world. I mean, if you are in the PPE world, you've got a mindset, and I think that's been very clear yesterday and today. And I'm grateful, to have these colleagues with me, as we go through these highs and lows.
Thank you. And Sean, after hearing all the sharings, do you feel like your job will be Will it get more complicated or less complicated?
I think it doesn't matter what I do. I still spend a lot of time trying to explain all the different standards that across the board to every new person that comes up that has to do something. So it's not going to get any worse or easier for me, no matter how much I try and maximize my laziness by gathering everything together in a single point. We don't have a single group in the as a federal standard, just unifying all of these different standards that are maybe government or private industry led across the board. Even if you're looking at other responses, healthcare topic of one of the days right now is high path avian influenza. And I have to explain to people, it's like, yes, you have to be fit tested. No, it's not just putting a mask on. That is making sure the mask fits, getting a medical examination, getting training, and having a record retention policy and plan that associate with that. And so it's far more complicated than many people do look at when they come and they say, well, I have a Tyvek suit. And it's like, no, Tyvek is a specific kind of material. And this one that you have on right now does not meet the standard that the CDC puts forth of the ASTM 1670 to meet the liquid penetration needs inside of a chicken coop as you're trying to do a mass culling. So I greatly appreciate that people are getting more involved in the need for PPE and to make sure that they protect themselves so they don't end up at the healthcare side and needing to be treated for something on this. But I don't see it becoming any less complicated anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiang. Now back to Anne. And so any talking points from other speakers that give you more hope?
I was just going to add, I thank you. From on a day-to-day basis, I can feel pretty tired and beaten down by this whole challenge and struggle. But the silver lining of COVID has been the opportunity to collaborate with people like those on this call, to be a member of the committee that advises NIOSH, the National Academy of Sciences. I mean, I know that there are people in this country who are working hard to make the changes that we need. It just seems like it takes too long. And it's just very complicated. So for me, I still think we need to really focus on our domestic manufacturing supply chain, that we need to be able to have that domestic capacity and then have our swing needs supplied offshore when we have a spike. But we need to focus in on a few of the core fundamentals. I also just still think that even though I either expand NIOSH's purview to include consumers, which I know is congressional work, but we need to have somebody who's looking out for the consumers. This is not like chewing gum. This is we need even chewing. I mean, I get the FDA recalls all the time, right? Enoki mushrooms have been recalled. Chocolates have contaminants. I mean, we need to have a way to have recalls on products, that substandard products in the market. We need to protect the consumers. This is respiratory protection. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now after having hearing, sorry, Colleen, you want to?
I just wanted to mention that we have at NIOSH been working on and keeping abreast of PPE by offering a PPE info web-based application, that we expanded during Ebola and so forth. And the problem is, I mean, frankly, we know what's needed. We don't have the resources to maintain something like that. So I agree with Anne. It's very important, to be able to provide that information accurately and well. And
Thank you. Thank you very much. Wow, I cannot believe this technical panel can get so heartfelt and emotional, which is my typical research methodology. And okay, so now I want to let's see whether we can answer a few questions from this audience. We've got quite a lot of questions. So one question was actually direct follow-up to Xiang's comment. How can we collaborate across states better, right? Across from Tennessee and Maryland, Washington, D.C., California, for maintaining stockpiles and efficient distribution. So anyone wants to take that?
So on our side, we work very closely with the Region 4 states. So we're separated into a larger bucket by the CDC as Region 4. So a lot of the southern states going from Florida to Kentucky. And then we do cross-region collaboration also. But a lot of the times it is difficult since every state has its own government, its own set of rules and laws and regulations that it must follow, especially depending on what they're allowed to do. So it varies greatly from state to state.
That's excellent. Anyone else wants to talk a little bit about? So Colin, you are actually based in Pittsburgh, right? And so, which by the way was where I did my PhD. Do you feel like there's any coordination between Pennsylvania and other states going on during the pandemic?
I can just speak to my experience. I am from upstate New York originally, so I took what was happening in New York, very much to heart, and was grateful to have the job that I have because I could go to work every day and be helping. But I did start to track as inquiries came in, that we were getting new applicants from all over the country, and it was concerning, right? Because we knew based on prior responses that this wasn't going to be sustainable. I mean, even one new approval holder from every state, there was not going to be a market to sustain that. So I tried to track that. Maybe I fooled myself that I was, as I learned a few months down the road. But there seems to me that there were certain states that were aware of how to get funding to do what they needed to do, and other states were behind. So I don't have the answers, but I certainly, saw trends. And I mean, I'm not at all, trying to be political, but you have to wonder how the response would have been different if it hadn't happened during an election year. Maybe naturally it would have been more collaborative amongst the states. And certainly I think from the NIOSH perspective, when we are going to do something, we need to be more aware of how we campaign it. So we did an interim final rule to update our PAPR standard. It was something that we had been working on for years that was based on what healthcare workers wanted, right? To get away from those big, heavy industrial PAPRs. And then we did it, and we found out healthcare workers were concerned it didn't offer the same protection, even though we designed it to be the same. So I think there are things that we can do in terms of when we're launching something, to communicate better. But again, it all takes, time and resources.
Excellent, thank you very much. Now I do want to bring back to the theme of this workshop is actually eventually look for building a more resilient supply chain. And resilience obviously is a very loaded word, right? But really, how do the standards and supply chain structure go hand in hand? So this is one of the questions from the audience. I know Chris talked a little bit about domestic regionalized supply chain, but I do want to hear from the rest of the panel about what, in your ideal world, what should the supply chain structure look like? I don't like a cold calling, but
well, yeah, I would say in an ideal world for the healthcare industry, it'd be simplification so that there's not all of these subcategories of if we're using N95 as the focal point, because that one drives everyone nuts. There should be a simplified standard, and then if we have to have standards, and I understand why we need the standards, and I'm not advocating against them, but then and then another half of my brain says, and it was brought up earlier, I forgot who brought it up, and I know there's been a lot of work on this, is to create, if it's possible, a universal respirator that is comfortable, that is, it's implied if you're wearing it to the standard or to the manufacturer's instructions that you're going to have a fit test or you'll be fitted properly and things like that. I think the technology is there to bring that to bear. If we can bring that to bear, it makes all these other issues that get in our way moot, because we've simplified it to the device. So that would be my nirvana.
Thank you. So then, Sean, you mentioned the issue of fit, and so one of the audience members asked us that the regulation says that the respirator must fit a variety of face shapes and sizes, either by offering one size that does so, or by offering multiple sizes. Now the question is that kind of standard certainly does not really necessarily address availability issue. So how can we assess that? If we have the standards but we don't have a PPE available, or we have a PPE available, they don't fit. How are we going to deal with that?
That was actually my comment in the chat. That is in our regulation, that the respirators must be designed to fit a variety of face shapes and sizes. And at this time, we don't have for particulate only respirators, we don't have a way to say this is how you come to us and say that you've met that requirement. So we've been trying to work on that for over 2 decades, and the ASTM respirator fit capability standard was developed by a consensus work group, and we're hoping to incorporate that into our regulation. And I think that in general, as we talk about, underserved populations, fit matters for PPE, and it always should have. And it does need to be, considered in the standards. And if you're talking about the public, then the investment's even larger, right? So whereas I might say you have to do a test panel of 25 people to show that your respirator can fit someone, if you want something that can just fit the general public where they're putting it on, you've got to try it on a lot more people to be, statistically sound.
Excellent. Thank you, Colleen. Looks like our panel run out of time, but I do want to ask the last question. I realized Mary Ann made this point a few weeks ago, that she was seeing her doctor who was not wearing the right kind of PPE. So which begs the question, I actually want to ask Barbara and Anne just really quick reaction, that we have talked about a lot of standards. Certainly they're not being enforced very strictly, right? So nobody's going to be arrested for wearing wrong kind of PPE. Just realistically speaking, how we are going to restructure our supply chains to get better for next crisis?
Well, Dr. Dye, I think that the key thing that I'm hearing from this esteemed panelist, we need better products. I am stunned by Skip's comment that 7 out of 10 fit tests fail. So we're not providing even the basics that our healthcare workers and our community need. And I share the shock. In the early days, I remember seeing someone that I had a tremendous amount of trust for in a clinical setting wearing an N95 with an exhalation valve, not realizing that kind of defeated the whole purpose of protecting others from what's coming out of your mouth, because it was spewing everywhere. So not only do we need just better collaboration, but we can do better. We can make these products better so that they actually do fit faces better than they currently do. So I remain an optimist. Sometimes I wonder why, but I think this team has really made me feel like there is a tremendous amount of hope, but we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And
just a couple really quick remarks. One is that there are people who have developed respirators that are not made out of the SMS material, right? And we tend to go back into our old thinking, but there are microporous materials and other innovations in terms of the variety of sizes. So we should be open to these new ideas. The other piece of it, though, that I come back to about physicians not using the right, or healthcare workers, is education. People just don't understand, right? And it goes all the way back. Probably the place that needs to be incorporated is like in the infectious disease curriculum when people are in medical school. Lisa Brousseau, who's no longer here, she said in another National Academy meeting that I was at, that the use of these pleated surgical masks is cultural in healthcare. We know that they don't work. We need to change our practices, and we need to start in healthcare, and we need to be honest with people about what they really should be using. So I would really I agree with Jill Morgan. We need to use the science, but we need to change. We need to start educating physicians on what's the right thing, healthcare workers, what's the right thing to use, and then have that percolate out to the community. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. And that was a perfect prep for the next panel, which focuses on communication and education. I want to thank the entire panel for the remarks, for the sharings. Thanks to the public for your excellent questions. Your being here means that we still have a lot of hope. So now I'm going to pass on to Amrita John and Carolyn Sheridan for the next session. Touch some of the exact same topic that Anne just touched upon.